At 06:42 on February 26, 1945, pharmacist mate second-ass George Wallen crouched in a volcanic ash crater on Iwo Jima, watching his platoon advance toward airfield number 3 through a forest of Japanese mortars. 20 years old, 37 days as a combat corpsman, 14 Marines already dead in his company. The Japanese had fortified Hill 362 Alpha with 500 interconnected caves. Every yard the Marines gained cost blood. Wallen had landed on Iwo Jima 7 days earlier with Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines. The black volcanic sand clung to everything. The sulfur stench burned his throat, but the worst part was the screaming. Every advance brought the cry he'd been trained to answer. Corpsman, the 5th Marine Division had been promised a 4-day operation. General William Rupertus himself had told the men they'd secure the island quickly. That was before they discovered what Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had built into the island's volcanic rock. Underground hospitals, ammunition depots 20 ft below ground, machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire. By February 26th, the 5th Marine Division had suffered 3,000 casualties. Corpsman was dying faster than the Marines they tried to save. Japanese snipers had learned to spot the red crosses on helmets. They'd learned to listen for the word corpsman and aim for the voice that answered. Wallen had already treated 43 casualties in 7 days, sucking chest wounds, traumatic amputations, burns from flamethrower backblasts. He carried morphine seizes, sulfa powder, battle dressings, and plasma. 30 lb of medical supplies on his back while Marines carried rifles. The protocol was clear. Corpsman was unarmed. The Geneva Convention protected medical personnel, but the Japanese didn't care about Geneva. They targeted Corpsman deliberately. 14 Navy Hospital. Corpsman had already died in Wallen's battalion. Another 22 had been evacuated with wounds. At 7:15, Fox Company moved forward. Wallen followed 20 yards behind the assault element, watching for casualties. The terrain was impossible. Volcanic ridges and ravines turned every advance into a maze. Marines disappeared into gullies and didn't come back. Then the mortars started. Japanese observers on the high ground had perfect visibility. The first round hit 30 ft in front of Wallen's position. The second hit 15 ft behind him. The third landed directly in front of a rifleman named Corporal James McKenna. Wallen ran forward without thinking. This was what he'd trained for at Camp Pendleton. This was why he'd volunteered for the Fleet Marine Force instead of staying in a hospital in California. McKenna was alive but bleeding from multiple wounds. Wallen dropped beside him and started working. Sulfa powder on the wounds, battle dressings packed tight. Then he heard the sound every corpsman dreaded, the hollow thump of a Japanese grenade launcher. If you want to see what happened when that grenade landed, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Wallen. The grenade hit 3 ft from Wallen's position. He saw it bounce once on the volcanic ash. He had maybe 2 seconds to react. McKenna couldn't move. The nearest cover was 15 ft away across open ground. And Wallen had a choice that would define everything that followed: stay and die with McKenna, or run and live by abandoning a wounded Marine. The grenade detonated. The blast threw Wallen sideways into the crater wall. His ears rang. His vision went white. Then the pain hit. Shrapnel had torn through his left eye and cheekbone. Blood poured down his face, mixing with volcanic ash and sulfur. McKenna was still alive. The grenade had missed him by inches, but now both of them were bleeding in an exposed position with Japanese mortar still falling. Wallen's medical training kicked in automatically. He couldn't see properly out of his left eye. The pain was excruciating, but McKenna had worse wounds, arterial bleeding from his leg. Without a tourniquet, he'd bleed out in 3 minutes. Wallen reached into his medical kit with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. His left eye was useless now. Everything on that side was dark and wet. But his right eye worked, his hands worked, and McKenna needed help now. He got the tourniquet on McKenna's leg at 0723. Then he packed the other wounds with sulfa powder and battle dressings. The whole time, Japanese machine guns riddled the crater. Bullets snapped overhead. More mortars fell 50 yards away. Other corpsmen saw what had happened. Pharmacist mate 3rd Class Robert Hayes crawled forward to help. He took one look at Wallen's face and said they needed to evacuate immediately. Both casualties, standard procedure. Get them back to the battalion aid station. Wallen refused. There were still Marines advancing toward airfield number 3. Fox Company was pushing into the most heavily defended sector on Iwo Jima. Every corpsman counted. Hayes could take McKenna back. Wallen was staying. Hayes argued for 30 seconds. Then he gave up. You couldn't order a corpsman to leave the line. Everyone was a volunteer. Everyone had chosen to be here. If Wallen wanted to stay half-blind and bleeding, that was his decision. They got McKenna onto a stretcher at 0735. 4 Marines carried him back through the volcanic ash while Hayes provided security. Wallen stayed in the crater, temporarily blind in one eye, watching Fox Company advance through hell. By 0800, the adrenaline started wearing off. The pain in his face became impossible to ignore. His left eye socket felt like someone had poured molten metal into it. The sulfa powder he dumped on his own wounds burned like acid. But Fox Company was still moving forward, and Marines were still getting hit. At 81:15, another cry, "Corpsman!" This time it came from an adjacent platoon that had lost their own corpsman to a sniper 20 minutes earlier. Wallen climbed out of his crater and ran toward the voice. His depth perception was gone. He kept stumbling on the uneven ground, but he could still carry plasma. He could still pack wounds. He could still do his job. The wounded Marine was Private First Class Thomas O'Brien from Pittsburgh. Shrapnel in his chest and abdomen, sucking chest wound. Without immediate treatment, O'Brien would drown in his own blood. Wallen got an occlusive dressing on the chest wound. Then he started an IV of plasma. His hands moved through the procedures automatically. Camp Pendleton training. 6 months of field medical drills. Every scenario they'd practiced in California was happening now in real life. While Wallen worked, Japanese mortars found their range again. The first round landed 40 FT away. The second landed 20 FT away. The third was coming straight for O'Brien's position. And this time Wallen couldn't see it coming from his blind side. The explosion lifted both men off the ground. Wallen landed on his back in the volcanic ash. The second explosion had hit closer than the first. New pain erupted across his lower back and shoulders. Hot metal had punched through his dungarees and into muscle tissue. O'Brien was unconscious but breathing. The plasma line had torn loose, blood soaked through the chest dressing. Wallen needed to restart the IV immediately. He tried to sit up. His back screamed in protest. Something was wrong with his spine. Not severed, he could still feel his legs, but movement sent lightning bolts of agony through his torso. Other Marines had seen the explosion. 2 riflemen crawled forward to help. They wanted to carry both casualties back to the battalion aid station. Wallen and O'Brien together. Get them both evacuated before the next mortar barrage. Wallen refused again. O'Brien needed evacuation immediately, but Wallen could still work. His legs functioned. His right eye functioned. His hands functioned. That was enough. The Marines looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Blood covered his face from the eye wound. Now blood soaked his back from the shrapnel. He could barely sit upright, but he was arguing that he should stay on the line. They took O'Brien back at 8:40. Wallen stayed in the crater, adding back wounds to his growing collection of injuries. He dumped sulfa powder over his shoulders as best he could reach. Then he wrapped battle dressings around his torso and kept moving. By 0900, Fox Company had advanced 200 YD. They'd reached the base of Hill 362 Alpha. Every cave entrance vomited machine gun fire. Every ravine hid Japanese soldiers with grenades. The casualty rate was climbing fast. Wallen treated 6 more Marines between 0900 and 0930, mostly shrapnel wounds, 1 traumatic amputation from a mine, another sucking chest wound. He was running low on plasma. His medical kit was nearly empty, but he kept working. The corpsmen in adjacent battalions were taking catastrophic losses. One battalion had lost 68% of its medical personnel in the first week. Navy hospital corpsmen were dying at twice the rate of the Marines they served, but they kept answering the call. Every time someone screamed, "Corpsman," someone came running. At 0945, battalion headquarters sent word through the company commander. Captain William Chambers personally found Wallen and ordered him to the rear. Not a suggestion, an order. The corpsman was wounded twice. He needed proper medical treatment. He needed evacuation. Wallen said he'd go after the current attack finished. Fox Company was about to assault Hill 362 Alpha directly. They'd need every corpsman available. He'd evacuate after the hill was secured. Chambers knew he couldn't force the issue. Corpsman wasn't a regular Marine. They answered to the Navy medical chain of command, and they'd all volunteered for this duty. If Wallen wanted to die on this island, that was his choice to make. The assault on Hill 362 Alpha began at 1,000 hours on February 26th. Japanese defenders had spent months fortifying the position. Pillboxes covered every approach. Interlocking machine guns made movement nearly impossible. Marines advanced 10 yards and lost men, advanced another 10 yards and lost more. Wallen followed the assault wave. His back was on fire. His left eye was useless, but his hands still worked, and Marines were falling faster than ever. At 10:15, he reached a wounded rifleman named Corporal Stephen Martinez, then another named Private James Wilson. Then 3 more Marines were caught in a machine gun crossfire. He was working on the 5th casualty when someone grabbed his shoulder from behind. Another corpsman, pharmacist mate, First Class Donald Mitchell from the company headquarters element. Mitchell had been sent specifically to relieve Wallen and force him off the line. Mitchell took one look at Wallen's face and back and said they were leaving immediately. No argument this time. Wallen had done enough. He'd earned his evacuation, time to go. But Wallen was looking past Mitchell at something Mitchell couldn't see yet. Another group of Marines had just walked into a kill zone 200 yards ahead. The machine guns opened up. 6 Marines went down in the first 10 seconds. Japanese machine guns from 3 different positions converged on 100 square feet of volcanic ash. The Marines who survived dove for cover in shallow craters that offered almost no protection. Mitchell grabbed Wallen's arm. They needed to leave now. Let other corpsmen handle this. Wallen had given enough. Wallen pulled free and started running toward the machine gun fire. His back screamed with every step. His vision swam. But 6 Marines were bleeding out in the open, and nobody was moving to help them. The other corpsman was pinned down or dead. Fox Company had lost 3 medical personnel in the last hour alone. Mitchell watched Wallen run into the kill zone and made his own decision. He followed. They reached the first casualty at 10:23. Private First Class Robert Davidson, 19 years old, from Oregon. Multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen, still conscious, still breathing, but bleeding internally and deteriorating fast. Wallen and Mitchell worked together. Mitchell started the plasma line. Wallen packed the wounds. Japanese machine guns kept firing overhead. Bullets snapped through the air so close they could feel the displacement. But they kept working. They stabilized Davidson in 4 minutes. Then they moved to the next casualty, then the next. 6 wounded Marines in that kill zone. Wallen and Mitchell treated all 6 while Japanese defenders poured fire into their position. Later, battalion records would show they spent 17 minutes in that exposed area. 17 minutes that should have killed them both. At 10:45, Marines with flamethrowers finally silenced the machine gun positions. The surviving members of Fox Company pulled back to consolidate. Battalion casualties had reached 240 men in 7 days. One rifle company had lost 72% of its original strength. Mitchell got Wallen to the battalion aid station at 1100 hours. Navy surgeons took one look at the eye wound and the back wounds and prepped him for evacuation. They had him on a stretcher heading for the beach when Wallen climbed off and walked back toward his company. The surgeons couldn't believe it. This corpsman had been wounded twice in 4 hours. His left eye was destroyed. Shrapnel filled his back. He could barely walk straight. But he was refusing evacuation again and heading back to the front line. Captain Chambers found out about Wallen's return at 11:30. He pulled the corpsman aside and asked directly, what would it take to get him evacuated? What injury would be serious enough? Wallen didn't have a good answer. He just knew Fox Company was still advancing. The battle for Iwo Jima wasn't over. As long as Marines were fighting, corpsmen needed to be there. That was the job. That was what he'd signed up for. Chambers gave up trying to force the issue. He assigned Wallen to the company command post, where he could treat casualties coming through the aid station instead of running forward under fire. Safer duty, less exposed. Wallen agreed to the compromise. For the next 5 days, Wallen worked from the company aid station. His left eye never recovered. The socket remained swollen and painful. His back wounds grew infected despite sulfa powder, but he kept treating casualties. Fox Company lost another 80 men between February 26th and March 2nd. On March 2nd, Fox Company received orders to assault the final defensive line before Katano Point. Japanese defenders had concentrated the remaining strength in a series of caves and bunkers overlooking the northern coast. Intelligence estimated 300 enemy soldiers remained in the sector. The estimate was wrong. There were closer to 800. The assault began at 0700 on March 2nd. Within minutes, Fox Company walked into the heaviest concentration of defensive fire they'd encountered since landing on Iwo Jima. Mortars, artillery and machine guns from positions the Marines didn't know existed. Casualties mounted immediately. The company aid station filled with wounded men faster than the medical staff could process them. Wallen worked through the chaos, stabilizing casualties for evacuation. His back was screaming. His ruined eye throbbed, but his hands kept moving through the familiar procedures. At 8:30, a Japanese mortar found the aid station. The explosion killed 2 Marines and sent shrapnel through everyone within 20 feet. Wallen took metal fragments in his lower back, the same area that had been hit 6 days earlier. New wounds on top of old wounds. This time, the injury was serious enough that even Wallen couldn't ignore it. The shrapnel had driven deep into muscle tissue near his spine. He couldn't stand up straight. Every movement sent shock waves of pain through his torso, but Fox Company was still in contact, and the next 24 hours would test everything Wallen had left. Navy surgeons at the battalion aid station looked at Wallen's new wounds and decided for him. This wasn't negotiable anymore. He was being evacuated to Guam. The back injury was too severe. Without proper treatment, the infection would kill him within days. They put Wallen on a stretcher at 0900 on March 2nd. 4 Marines carried him toward the beach where landing craft waited to transfer casualties to hospital ships offshore. Wallen didn't argue this time. The pain was too intense. He'd finally hit his limit. The stretcher team made it 300 YD before Fox Company's radio operator caught up with them. Emergency traffic from the battalion commander. The assault on Katano Point had turned into a disaster. Fox Company had taken 40% casualties in 90 minutes. Every corpsman with the forward elements was dead or wounded. They needed Wallen back immediately. The stretcher bearers looked at each other. Then they looked at Wallen. The corpsman was half conscious from pain and blood loss. His back wounds were still bleeding through the dressings. Taking him back to the front line was insane. Wallen told them to turn around. The Fox Company needed corpsman. He could still work. Get him back to the company position. They carried him back at 0930. By 1,000 hours, Wallen was back at the company aid station, treating casualties despite wounds that should have had him on a hospital ship. Other medical personnel couldn't understand it. This corpsman had been wounded twice in 6 days. Now he'd been wounded a 3rd time, but he kept refusing evacuation. The assault on Katano Point continued throughout March 2nd. Fox Company gained 200 yards at the cost of 63 casualties. Wallen treated 37 of them personally. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel wounds, burns from flamethrowers, and traumatic amputations from mines. By nightfall on March 2nd, Fox Company had been reduced to a company strength of 97 men. They'd started the Iwo Jima operation with 240. In 11 days, they'd lost nearly 60% of their personnel. The 5th Marine Division as a whole had suffered 8,000 casualties. The island still wasn't secured. Wallen spent the night of March 2nd in agony. His back wounds had become infected. Pus leaked through the dressings. His ruined left eye socket throbbed with every heartbeat. He was running a fever. But morning would bring another assault, and Fox Company still needed corpsmen. March 3rd began at 0630 with a Japanese artillery barrage. Enemy observers had spotted Fox Company's position during the night. High-explosive shells walked through the Marine lines, killing and wounding men before they could even begin the day's advance. The assault on Katano Point resumed at 0700. Fox Company pushed forward across 600 YD of open terrain. No cover, no concealment. Japanese defenders had perfect fields of fire from elevated positions. Every yard the Marines advanced cost blood. Wallen followed the assault element. He could barely walk upright. The back pain was excruciating, but Marines were falling, and someone had to treat them. At 0720, he reached a wounded rifleman, then another. Then 3 more were caught in a machine gun crossfire. An adjacent platoon took heavy casualties at 7:45. Their comrade had been killed 2 days earlier. They'd been operating without dedicated medical support since then. When Marines started falling, they screamed for any comrade who could hear them. Wallen heard. He moved toward their position across open ground, swept by continuous fire. Japanese machine guns, mortars, rifle fire from a dozen hidden positions. The volcanic ash erupted in fountains as bullets impacted all around him. He reached the adjacent platoon at 0800. 14 Marines were wounded, some critically. Most had been lying in the open for 20 minutes or more without treatment. Internal bleeding, arterial bleeding, sucking chest wounds. Without immediate help, half of them would die. Wallen started working. First casualty, second casualty, Third, he moved through the wounded men systematically, triaging and treating. Plasma here, battle dressings there, morphine for the ones in shock. His medical training took over completely. The pain in his back faded into background noise. Japanese defenders realized a corpsman was working in the open. Machine guns shifted fire. Mortars adjusted. Rifle fire concentrated on the one man trying to save 14 Marines. Bullets kicked up ash all around Wallen's position. He kept working. At 0823, a Japanese sniper fired from an elevated position 300 YD away. The bullet hit Wallen in his right leg just below the knee. The impact spun him around and dropped him face first into the volcanic ash. His right leg wouldn't support his weight anymore. The femoral artery was intact, but muscle and bone were damaged. He couldn't stand, couldn't walk, but 12 wounded Marines still needed treatment, and the nearest corpsman was 200 YD away. Wallen started crawling. The volcanic ash was hot enough to burn exposed skin. Wallen dragged himself forward using his elbows and one good leg. His right leg left a trail of blood in the black sand. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his back wounds. But there was a wounded Marine 50 yards ahead who would die without plasma. Private First Class Kenneth Morrison, 21 years old from Kansas, was wounded by shrapnel in his abdomen and chest. Morrison had been lying in the open for 30 minutes. Blood loss and shock were shutting down his organs. Without intervention in the next 10 minutes, he'd be dead. Wallen crawled. 10 yards. 20 yards. Japanese snipers saw the movement and adjusted their aim. Bullets snapped overhead. One round hit the ash 2FT from Wallen's head. Another tore through his pack, destroying his last bottles of plasma. But he kept moving. At 30 yards, Wallen's right leg went completely numb. Nerve damage from the bullet wound. He couldn't feel anything below his knee anymore. Just dead weight dragging behind him as he pulled himself forward with his arms. At 40 yards, a Japanese machine gun opened fire. The gunner walked his rounds toward Wallen's position. Geysers of ash erupted in a line, getting closer. Then, Marines with a Browning automatic rifle suppressed the position long enough for Wallen to cover the last 10 yards. He reached Morrison at 8:35. The Marine was barely conscious, pulse weak and thready, respirations shallow, classic signs of hypovolemic shock. Morrison needed whole blood, needed a surgeon, needed to be in a hospital not bleeding out in volcanic ash. Wallen had sulfa powder, battle dressings, and morphine. He had training and 21 days of experience treating casualties on Iwo Jima. He packed Morrison's wounds and administered morphine. Then he pulled the Marine's body close to his own, using himself as a shield against incoming fire. Other corpsmen saw what was happening. Pharmacist Mate First Class James Chen had been treating casualties 200 YD away. He grabbed his medical kit and started running toward Wallen's position. Japanese fire intensified immediately. Chen made it 30 yards before machine gun rounds forced him into cover. Marines tried to provide suppressive fire, but Japanese positions were too well fortified. Concrete pillboxes, steel doors that opened to fire and closed for protection, interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. The defensive system Colonel Nakagawa had built into Iwo Jima was nearly perfect. At 0845, Fox Company's commander called for artillery support. 15 minutes later, 105mm howitzers from the 5th Marine Division Artillery began pounding the Japanese defensive line. High explosive shells walked through the enemy positions. Smoke and debris filled the air. Under the cover of the barrage, 4 Marines reached Wallen's position with a stretcher. They loaded Morrison first, then they tried to load Wallen. The corpsman refused. There were still wounded Marines in the kill zone. 11 men he'd treated earlier. They needed evacuation. Someone had to coordinate their movement to the rear. The Marines argued for 10 seconds. Then they gave up. You couldn't reason with Wallen. They'd been trying for a week. The man had been shot 3 times and he was still refusing evacuation. Logic didn't apply anymore. They took Morrison back at 900. Wallen stayed in the ash coordinating stretcher teams. His right leg was useless. His back was on fire. His left eye socket throbbed. But 11 Marines needed help, and he was the only corpsman in a position to provide it. Between 0900 and 0930, stretcher teams evacuated 8 of the 11 wounded Marines. The other 3 were dead. Wallen had tried to save them, but they'd lost too much blood before he could reach them. Arterial bleeding, catastrophic trauma. Some wounds were beyond even the best medical treatment. At 0940, another corpsman finally reached Wallen's position, pharmacist Mate Second Ass Robert Hayes. the same corpsman who tried to evacuate Wallen after the first grenade blast on February 26th. Hayes looked at Wallen's leg and didn't say anything. Words weren't necessary. They both knew what came next. Hayes got Wallen onto a stretcher at 0950. This time the corpsman didn't argue. He'd finally reached the point where he physically couldn't continue. 3 gunshot wounds, multiple shrapnel wounds. His right leg wouldn't support his weight. His left eye was destroyed. His back wounds were severely infected. 4 Marines carried the stretcher toward the battalion aid station. Wallen lost consciousness halfway there. Blood loss and shock finally overwhelmed his system. By the time they reached medical personnel at 10:15, his pulse was barely palpable. Blood pressure is critically low. The doctors weren't sure he'd survive the next hour. But George Wallen had one advantage the doctors didn't know about yet. He'd spent the last week watching Marines fight through impossible situations. He'd seen men with catastrophic wounds refuse to quit. He'd learned that survival wasn't always about the severity of your injuries. Sometimes it was about deciding you weren't done yet. The doctors started emergency treatment at 10:20 on March 3, 1945, and they had no idea what was about to happen next. Navy surgeons at the battalion aid station stabilized Wallen enough for evacuation. By 1100 hours on March 3rd, he was on a landing craft heading to a hospital ship offshore. The USS Samaritan took him directly to surgery. 3 hours of operations. Doctors removed shrapnel from his leg and back. They couldn't save his left eye. The grenade blast on February 26th had destroyed too much tissue. The numbers told the story. Between February 19th and March 3rd, Fox Company sustained 183 casualties. Wallen personally treated 67 Marines under fire. 14 of those were the men he'd saved on March 3rd after being shot in the leg. All 14 survived. Battalion medical officers calculated that without Wallen's intervention, at least 9 would have died from blood loss before stretcher teams could reach them. The broader statistics were equally stark. Of 2,500 Navy crewmen who landed on Iwo Jima, 332 were killed. Another 659 were wounded. Corpsmen died at nearly twice the rate of the Marines they served. Despite these losses, corpsmen kept answering the call. Wallen's story spread through the 5th Marine Division like electricity. 20 years old, 3 gunshot wounds, refused evacuation twice, crawled 50 yards to reach wounded Marines. Pharmacist Mate 3rd Class Donald Patterson was treating casualties with the 27th Marines when he heard that Patterson had been considering requesting transfer to a rear echelon unit. But if Wallen could keep working after being shot 3 times, Patterson could finish his deployment on the front line. Similar stories played out across the division. Corpsman who was exhausted found new energy. One 20-year-old from Utah had shown them what was possible when you refused to quit. Wallen spent 9 months in military hospitals. Guam, Hawaii, Oakland Naval Hospital, multiple surgeries, physical therapy, and nightmares every night. Marines screaming for corpsmen, grenade blast, the smell of blood and volcanic ash. Then something unexpected arrived that changed everything. On October 5, 1945, George Wallen stood on the south lawn of the White House. President Harry Truman was prepared to present the Medal of Honor. 14 servicemen received the medal that day, all for Iwo Jima. Truman read Wallen's citation aloud. Wounded 3 times, refused evacuation twice, crawled 50 yards with a useless leg to save 14 Marines under continuous fire. Wallen answered reporters' questions politely but briefly. He didn't feel like a hero. The real heroes were the Marines who died on Iwo Jima, the corpsmen who didn't make it home. The nightmares gradually faded. Meeting his future wife Melba helped. They married in 1946. The nightmare stopped completely after the wedding. In 1948, Wallen re-enlisted in the United States Army as a medical technician. He served in Korea, then Vietnam in 1967 as a medical officer. Wounded again, his 4th Purple Heart. He retired in 1968 after 20 years across 3 wars, worked for the Veterans Administration for another decade. In 2004, President Bush signed legislation renaming the Salt Lake City VA Medical Center after him. Federal buildings couldn't normally bear the names of living persons. Congress made an exception. Wallen passed away on June 5, 2009 at the age of 84, Utah's last living Medal of Honor recipient. Over 2,000 people attended his memorial service. 4 Navy corpsmen received the Medal of Honor for Iwo Jima. 2 died in combat, 2 survived. Between them, they showed an entire generation what was possible when you refused to accept that casualties were lost. 14 Marines survived March 3rd because a 20-year-old crawled 50 yards with a bullet in his leg. And thousands of corpsmen over the following 80 years learned what devotion to duty looked like. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about corpsmen who saved lives with plasma and courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure George Wallen doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that.